Welcome to Idea to IPO. Hello, my name is Jennifer. Idea to IPO has been holding tech startup events in Silicon Valley for many, many years. We organize venture capital panels, legal workshops, networking events, and more. Check out our schedule at ideatoipo.com. Our featured speaker today is Roger Royce, and he is one of the top venture capital attorneys in Silicon Valley. And he's passionate about helping entrepreneurs succeed. Ladies and gentlemen, Roger Royce. Roger, please take it away.
Okay, well, thank you, Jennifer. Thanks for that introduction. My name is Roger Royce. I'm a partner with the law firm of Haynes Boone. I'm resident in the Palo Alto office. Haynes Boone is an AmLaw 100. It's Haynes and Boone LLP. It's an AmLaw 100 law firm with offices all over the country and other parts of the world. So let's try this. Try to put this on speaker view. So today, this is an Idea to IPO event, Funding 101 for tech entrepreneurs. And I have a few housekeeping items before we get started, and people are still joining, I see, so I will talk slowly. First of all, the format for today is 1 hour of presentation, followed by 30 minutes of Q&A. So as we go along, if you have questions, go ahead and put your questions into the Q&A dialog box, not the chat box, but the Q&A box, and I'll go ahead and get to those at the end. Just too hard to scroll through all of the comments and chat, but Q&A, I can find your questions. Secondly, I want to let you know that we are recording this, and if you've signed up or registered for this event, you will be getting a copy of the recording together with an advanced digital copy of my new book, 10,000 Startups, Strategies for Legal Success, or Legal Strategies for Startup Success, rather. It'll be a digital copy. If you want a hard copy, you can pre-order it on Amazon. It'll be available in another month or two. Believe it or not, I'm still making like little edits to it. So the print version is not quite ready, but I do have a digital version. All right, so if you're tweeting today, use hashtag Idea to IPO. Find us on our LinkedIn page. I'm going to post in the chat my information in a minute here. But while I'm doing that, I think I'm going to take a poll here and find out who we have in the audience. So let me know who's in the audience, who's a startup entrepreneur, who's an investor, who's from industry, who's just technology, etc. Any press, any students? And while I'm doing that, I'm going to go ahead and post my information. Feel free to find me on LinkedIn or go ahead and post your LinkedIn information. Wow, mostly startup people. We got some investors. We got some people who just like technology. We got some students and some service providers like me. Okay, that's interesting. All righty. I'm going to end the poll in a couple of seconds here. But so far it is 65% service providers, about 10% investors. A third of you are tech enthusiasts. We've got some press here today, so be careful what I say. Some academia, more than usual, students and teachers, I assume, and more than usual service providers. Interesting. Okay, that is the end of that poll. That is not the end of all my polls. I have one more poll. We try to mix these events up and do it at different times of the day, just so we can, because as you know, Idea to IPO has a global reach. They're all over the globe, all over the world, and in a lot of different time zones. So today we're coming to you at 9 a.m. Pacific, and that ought to allow us to get some more people from other parts of the world in our typical noon and 5 o'clock events. So where's everybody from is my next question. And while you're doing that, I would suggest that at some point you go ahead and take a look at my YouTube channel. I'm going to post this video and all the other ones we've done on startup topics, venture capital topics. you will find on my YouTube channel. So go to that YouTube channel and subscribe, hit that subscribe button. And then you won't miss out on any great content. All right, what do we got here? We've got a lot of North America, 14% Silicon Valley, about 50% other North America. Well, that's a lot. 20% Europe. That's more than usual, I think. We've got South and Latin America. We've got Asia. We've got Africa. So that sort of makes sense. I don't know what time it is, and it's probably super late. Oh, I didn't put India up here. Guess we'll include that in Asia. All right, so mostly 14, so 60% is North America, including Silicon Valley, about 60%, and about 10%, about 23% is Europe, and the rest Asia. Okay, good to know. I'll keep that in mind. Also, I want to let people know we do have LinkedIn groups. Oops, wrong one. Let me give you the link. Well, let me try that again. Let me give you the link to our LinkedIn startup group, which you might want to take a look at. Join the group, and you can stay on top of a lot of awesome content. All right, now we come to the presentation portion, and here's what we're going to do. I'm going to share my screen. Don't freak out yet. All right, you should see somebody send me a chat and let me know that you see my first slide. We did this once where I talked for 20 minutes with no slides up. So I want to make sure, all right, you can see it. Thank you, thank you. Okay, thank you everybody. Funding 101 for tech entrepreneurs. Why don't we get going here? Again, my name is Roger Royce. I'm a partner with Haynes Boone in Palo Alto. Thank you for coming to the event today, Funding 101. I want to keep in mind that even though I'm a lawyer, I'm not your lawyer. And what you're going to hear today is going to be a lot of law, but it's not legal advice. In order to have legal advice, you and I have to have an attorney-client relationship, and I have to know your exact facts. I'm going to be talking more in generalities. All right. I'll tell you what, Emil, if you want to text me what it is exactly I need to do to share the chat, I'll try and do it because I've never been able to figure out how to do that. Okay, so let's get started. This is Funding 101. So I want to just talk a little bit about where money comes from, because that's what we're going to talk about is financing. And, there are plenty of resources available for startups. And I will tell you that right now, there has never been more money. I know I say that every time I come on for the last 2 years because the amounts keep growing, but there's never been more money available for startups than there is now. There's a tremendous amount of financing out there in the market. But there are a few facts that you should know about going into this. First of all, most startups are going to use founder money to get going. About 3/4 of them are going to use some part of personal savings. And the thing, I'll talk more about this later, but some of your personal savings doesn't mean all of your personal savings, okay? You should use enough so you got skin in the game, but not so much that you might do something crazy to keep your company alive. We'll talk more about that later. But just keep in mind that if you're not willing to bet on your company, it's going to be hard to get other people to bet on it as well, especially given the low success rates in startup land, and that's just the case. So these numbers are a little low, but you can see that startup valuations are growing. And it's if I could bring these numbers forward to 2022, they would be even bigger now because there's so much money chasing deals. Most of the funds that this audience is probably interested in are located here in the US, but not all of them. One of the things that we saw probably as a result of COVID is a lot more dispersal of funds. A lot of my venture capital clients have moved to Miami and Austin and other parts of the world. So you'll see sources of funds more dispersed than right here in Silicon Valley. I'm going to come back to how many startups actually raise venture capital, but just so you know, it's a surprisingly small number. Now, since that statistic, I think it's gone up because there is so much venture capital in the system. But just keep in mind that even though venture is the holy grail, it might not be where you end up before you find a successful exit. And I have got plenty of companies that have never raised one single round of venture capital, but went to successful exits over and over again by angel money or other types of funding. So we will talk about venture capital, but that's not going to be everything that we'll talk about today. Now, before we get started, I want to give you the bad news first. And that's that startups are incredibly risky. If you didn't already know that, I will tell you that now. Charitably speaking, 9 out of 10 don't make it. Okay, the statistics are probably worse than that. It's a very difficult thing, a very risky thing. Investors know this. 20% don't make it past the first year. 30% 2 years. 50% within 5 years. Look at this: 70% of startups are going to dissolve within 10 years. These are numbers from Valerie, heck of a name. If you want to check it out, I'll send you the link in the slides. So what you're doing is very risky. The investors know that, and somehow you have to convince them that you're going to be that 1 in 10 that is going to make it. We did a panel here recently, or one of our venture capital panels for Idea to IPO about a month ago, where one of our investors mentioned that last year he invested in 1 in 300 companies that he saw. So with those odds, you can see that it's a lot of work trying to get venture. And I do want to talk a little bit about venture. So this is an interesting statistic I found. 50% of companies expect their next source of funding to be venture, but only 0.05% of companies get their next round from venture. So everybody's chasing venture, but most of the time it comes from someplace else. So let's talk a little bit about venture capital. That's a picture of a venture capitalist there, by the way, in case you were wondering. So we have to talk about it because even though I just told you how hard it is to get and how risky the capital is and how you have to really distinguish yourself, there is just so much money in the system. 2021 was a record year for startups, for investments, and for exits. It was twice the 2020 amounts in terms of venture capital investment, $330 billion. Those are incredible numbers. It wasn't that long ago when I was saying we'll never get past 100 billion. Here we are at 330 billion. 2022 is not letting up. Deals are proceeding at a furious pace. Also a tremendous amount in private equity investments, and a lot of that's going to smaller companies. Now, private equity is different. They're going to want to see EBITDA, they're going to want to see revenue, et cetera. So it's different than venture. It's lower risk, lower return, and bigger deals typically. But still, just to let you know how much investment money is out there. A lot of exits, both in the IPO and at SPACs, but lots of exits last year, and that is still continuing. And when there are exits, that leads to a rise in startups because people exit and they go start their next company. And the valuations of venture-backed companies now, $4.5 trillion. It's incredible how much money as an investment class is sitting in venture capital. And here's the best part. There's a lot of dry powder out there. Even though all that money was invested last year, there's still a lot of money left to be invested right now and going forward. So that's the good news. I gave you the bad news first, and gave you the good news next. Now, if you happen to be here in the Bay Area, where I guess about 16% of you are from, the Bay Area, even though it seems like everybody's moved to Texas and Florida, still, we had a record year for venture, $30 billion in Q3 of 2021. I should get newer numbers soon. Probably, I'm sure if I looked up the 2021 numbers, I'm sure it would be more than $100 billion in the Bay Area. That used to be a worldwide number not that long ago. So big money. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that are driving venture, some of the things that are driving investing, but more importantly, what it is that you need to do to be attracted to these sorts of investors. And like I say, we do a lot of venture capital panels for idea IPO. And one of the things that keeps coming up more and more now is ESG. And I see it even in my practice as a lawyer. I typically represent technology startups. I'm usually on the company side, sometimes on the investor side, but I'm mostly on the company side. And I'm seeing over the last couple of years, more and more, I'm getting questionnaires, due diligence questionnaires that go to ESG. What's ESG? Environmental, social, and governance. Although as a practical matter, they tend to focus on the E, the environmental. But we'll see questionnaires about, we want to see your policies on this, and your governance policies, and and what's your, how are you, depends on your business, but how are you free trade, how are you carbon neutral, et cetera, stuff like that. So one of the ways to make yourself more attractive to a venture fund, or any fund really, and even a lot of angel investors, is to be ESG. Let me put it that way. In other words, there are positive screens and negative screens, and these are the factors that are being considered. So if you can position yourself as being a socially useful business, you raise your odds of getting funded. And I'll tell you why. It's first of all, that's the VCs are demanding that. They all say they're very concerned about it, and I think they are, not because they're all such sweet people, maybe they are, I don't know, but because their investors are demanding it, because their money comes usually from big institutions who are being pushed for that sort of compliance. And then secondly, public companies now have to disclose, there's a big push with the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, for the ESG disclosures. And as public companies who are going to be acquirers of your company have to be concerned about this, then you, the target, have to be concerned about this. 20 years ago, maybe a little longer, a little more than that, we had a new law called Sarbanes-Oxley, which applied only to public companies. It required internal audits and financial controls. But what we saw is that drifted down into startups. So now you see most startups are going to have audits by the time or shortly after their first venture financing. They're going to have internal controls in place. They're going to have all this stuff they aren't technically required to have because their acquirers have to be SOX compliant. This is sort of like that. Because the acquirers are concerned about it, you have to be concerned about it as well. We talked about this, policies and compliance procedures, AML and anti-corruption. AML is anti-money laundering. KYC is know your customer. All right, the other thing that's worth mentioning is distributed ledger technology, or what we used to call blockchain, I suppose. And during COVID, we saw a lot of places where this became more useful in the supply chain. And I see this as an area of increased interest. So if there's a way to tokenize what you're doing, I don't know, some people say that may be cute, that may be gimmicky. I think that could be its own business in its own right, because there is certainly a tremendous amount of interest now in NFTs and tokenizing. And I'm seeing a lot of businesses tokenizing. Now, I will tell you that our SEC here in the United States, our Securities and Exchange Commission, is simply not caught up to this. We just don't have good laws in the US. We've got new wine, but we've got old bottles. Let me put it that way. And our existing antiquated securities laws don't really fit a lot of crypto businesses, which is doing two things. In my experience, it's forcing all ICOs offshore now, and has been for quite a while. And secondly, it's resulting in massive non-compliance. That's all I'm going to say about that. So just be super careful, because we just don't have a good framework. Secondly, we have an SEC that is generally overall hostile to this entire asset class. In fact, Gary Gensler has said to me personally that he does not even consider this an asset class. It's beneath him to even think about. So just keep that in mind, that we've got regulatory issues here in the US. It's not impossible, it's not, but it's certainly something that It's an opportunity for people, but it's something you have to be super careful about. We do several hours of presentations on this, so I won't belabor it now. Just understand that tokenization is still a path to liquidity, but you have to be super careful. And my rule of thumb is that it's always a security. I know everybody treats it as not a security, NFTs, tokens, except for a pure NFT that's really tied to something like a piece of art. But most tokens, I just take the default position that it's a security and try to find a path back from there. All right. So some of the very successful sectors that we've seen over the last, I guess, year, and since I put this slide together, it's probably even outdated. But I will just tell you what I'm seeing in my practice anecdotally, and this is not based on research, just what I'm seeing. Energy tech, of course, I think is going to be big, and I should put climate tech up next to it because I am seeing a lot of climate tech, and it's crossing over into energy and agriculture and a lot of other areas. Anything that reduces carbon sequestration, for example. Cybersecurity, of course, the world is a very dangerous place because of cyber threats. And I think cybersecurity has been a very hot market. Ag tech always. I do a lot of work with agriculture technology, and that is a field that every year just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Just when I think it's hit the summit, it just continues to grow. So agriculture technology, of course, precision medicine, of course, over the last 2 years, we've seen medicine really, really change. I think medicine has finally caught up to a lot of technological innovations. Food safety, sort of related to cybersecurity. There's certainly a lot more interest in that now. Again, we did a whole panel 2 weeks ago on agriculture technology companies. We talked a lot about this. So if you're interested in that, go to my YouTube page and take a look at that video. Here's property tech, what I call housing. That's one that has come out of the last couple of years, and more companies seem to be doing well with property technologies. And I've seen these for years. I've seen these for 20 years, really, but I'm just now seeing the market accept them and then they get traction. And sometimes timing is everything. And the timing is right for property tech for sure. And the rest of these are what you might expect. Autonomous vehicles. At Haynes Boone, we have an entire autonomous vehicle group devoted to self-driving cars and not only just cars, but autonomous tractors, satellites, anything autonomous. It's a very big field and it's going to get bigger. It's had some ups and downs, clearly, but I think it's going to be a big thing. All right. Okay, some basic principles that I'd like to go over before we get into some of the sources of funding. And just think of these as overriding guiding principles. And these should really kind of inform everything you do. And it's good to get these ideas in your head at the start and not be surprised later. So number one, your investors are your partners. Okay, you're going to be married to your investors. So just keep that in mind. In fact, it's even more binding than a marriage because they have so much money invested in you, and they might not agree with you and might not want to leave your company when you want them to. They are your partners, so make sure you get along with your investors before you bring them on. Now, they might have a small percentage, but they can still, we'll talk about this later, they can still take a very active role in your company. So don't go into this with the idea that some companies do that, oh, if I don't like this investor, I'll just give him his money back, or I'll just buy them out, or whatever, or they're going to be silent and passive and just let me do my own thing. That you're going to be in for a big surprise after the investment, if that's your mindset. Number two, stage your financing. A lot of people come to me even these days, surprisingly more often than you'd expect. And they say, I'm not going to waste time going to angels and raising small bits of money. I'm going right to the VCs and I'm going to get $10 million or $50 million right away because I have such a great idea. I guess, first of all, no, you're not going to do that. I mean, it used to happen. And I suppose for a serial entrepreneur who's got one heck of a track record, it could happen again, but it doesn't happen very often anymore. There's just too many better deals around for anybody to take that kind of risk. But more importantly, you wouldn't want to do it that way. You want to stage your financing. You want to take as little money as you need to get to the next valuation event. Because then when you take money later, you take it at a higher valuation, meaning you give up less of your company. If you take too much money early on, you're giving up too much of your company. Now that seems just so obvious, doesn't it? I mean, would you rather sell your stock at $1 a share or $10 a share? It seems so obvious, but people make this mistake regularly. And they do it because of the SAFE, which we will talk about later. That's a convertible instrument. It's where the investor gives you money now and you give them equity later. But the problem with the SAFEs, which I hope we have time to talk about, is that the SAFE will commit you to a certain valuation now, or a valuation cap now, that is going to be way less. In my experience, it's almost always way less than what it is later. When we first started doing these, by the way, SAFEs, the valuation cap was like this governor, just in case you had a runaway valuation. It was a way to protect the investor in case something crazy happened with the valuation. So the idea was it should rarely be triggered. You should rarely be converting your SAFE at the valuation cap. It's really morphed since then to be a proxy for today's valuation, which is a very dangerous thing because it means you might be selling more of your company at too little of valuation too early, and you might not even know it because it's not equity, it's a SAFE. I'll talk more about that later, or you can read all about it in my book, 10,000 Startups, which you'll be getting a copy of, or my last book, Dead on Arrival, How to Avoid Legal Mistakes. Okay, number 3. And I know I'm going super slow here, but that's all right. We've got lots to cover. Most funding is dilutive. Again, that seems like really obvious, but sometimes, people don't really understand what exactly that means. You're going to get diluted, okay? You're going to get diluted. Now, not always. If you have revenue, you don't get diluted. If you have a government grant, you don't get diluted. If you have I guess if you got a PPP loan that was forgiven, you didn't get diluted, right? So, but most funding is going to be dilutive, and you just have to get used to the fact that you're going to be giving up more and more of your company. I will tell you in these slides, and hopefully today, how much you should dilute and how much you should expect to dilute and how much is too much. Okay, here's another big one. Everybody gets very hung up on valuation. And valuation, and I think it's an ego issue. It's an ego issue, valuation of their company and what they think they're worth. And you should not look at it that way. This is just dollars and cents. This is just numbers. And when the investor is valuing their company, what you're worth is not what they're thinking about. What they're thinking about is, what is my expected return? In other words, what are we going to be able to sell this company for down the road? And how do I get my at least 30% annualized return if we have a sale at that price? So keep in mind that kind of get over the ego part of this, that valuation is what I'm worth. And plus, it's not your biggest issue either. Sometimes it is certainly a big issue, but read the fine print. I oftentimes tell stories about companies that got great valuations but ended up giving their company away because of other provisions in their deal documents. Things like anti-dilution protection, there's something called full ratchet, there's something called pay to play. There's a lot of ways that founders can really mess up because they're too focused on valuation and not focused enough on other issues. In fact, if everything goes perfectly for you, you'll get more than one term sheet. Valuation will only be one metric on which you evaluate term sheets. And you might not take the term sheet that has the biggest valuation because you might like other terms, like liquidation preferences, etc. Avoid early mistakes. I got a whole book on this. So because you're a startup, you're operating on a shoestring, and I get that. And you don't really want to spend a lot of money on a lot of, I had somebody come to me a few months ago who said, I'm going to avoid early mistakes. I would like to engage you to evaluate every possible legal risk this novel and new business could incur. Okay. I said, yeah, I could do that for $100,000. So, you're not going to do that. On the other hand, that's the first time ever that anyone's ever asked me to do that. We did not do that. That's just silly, right? You're going to take chances. You're going to take risk. What I want you to do is to avoid the obvious big mistakes, things like the wrong type of entity or incorporating in the wrong place, right? Or making a mistake with your intellectual property by giving it away to somebody, or making a mistake with employees by misclassifying them. So it's really easy these days to go online and do everything yourself. And that's not a problem till it's a problem. It's not a problem until you're successful and you find out that, and I go on and on about this in both my books, it's not a problem until you come to talk to the financiers, and that's when you find out there are problems. So if you're going to do something like that, you have to be super well educated as to where the traps are. So anyway, I think, the best way to avoid early mistakes is to hire somebody who's been through this 1,000 times and understands what those mistakes are. Take cheap money over expensive money. We'll talk more about what that means. Save your common stock for service providers. Because of crowdfunding, it's so easy now to just go online and sell common stock to investors. Don't do it. You're going to be sorry. I'll tell you why later. Here's a good tip. Get a data room. This is getting to be kind of specific now. It's not really a principle. This is more of a guideline. Not quite a rule. I'd say a guideline. Get a data room. It's just easier if you can just organize all your documents ahead of time. All righty. Let's move along now and get into the guts of the sources of funding. I'm going to focus on a few of these today, given our time, but I do want you to know there are lots of sources of funding out there. But since I work with technology startups, I hardly ever see debt. Founders put a little bit of money in, but again, not everything. Don't go into your 401k. Please don't do that. I prefer you not max out your credit cards. Don't completely deplete your savings, because what you're doing is super risky. You want to use other people's money for this. Government grants, more now, and surprisingly more now than there has been before, but not something I get involved in. Friends and family, that's where we generally start out. Angels and seed investors, institutional, then alternative funding. Let's just jump right into it. Like I said, most startups rely on personal savings for their initial funds. We talked enough about that. How much can you expect to raise from different groups? These are old numbers, I'm sure, because there's so much money in the system. They're probably twice this now. But angels used to be as 25 grand each. It's probably more like 50 to 100 each these days. Angel groups are now well over $1 million that they'll invest. An angel group is exactly what it sounds like. It's a group of high net worth individuals who get together, they evaluate a company, and they make an investment decision as a group. And early stage and late stage, those numbers have gone way up in terms of what VCs will invest in. Even early stage are way more than 1.5 now. All right. When you go talk to investors, here's some things to think about. Usually, you find yourself a lead investor that's going to be your cheerleader, or oftentimes you do, or ideally you do. Let me put it that way. You're way better off if you can do that. Here in Silicon Valley, way more deals than you think get made on a golf course, because one guy's in and he brings all his buddies in. And those deals are easy to spot because they fill up fast and they don't let other people who don't play golf like me invest in it. All right, so your lead should be what we call smart money. And what I mean by that, and by the way, you will always want smart money over dumb money. You always want somebody that understands your business, that knows what you're doing, that knows where you're going, can give you good advice, even if you don't like it or if you disagree. But you always want somebody that knows your company over somebody who doesn't. And the reason why is that if things go wrong, you're less likely to have a problem with the smart money investor than you are with the dumb money investor who's just out there with unreasonable, possibly, expectations. Make sure you get along with your investor. You're going to be living with them. They're your partner. Make sure they're committed to what you're doing. In other words, they're in it for the long term. It's ideally, that's what you want your lead. It's not a great thing if your investor won't invest in the follow-on rounds. It does not send a good signal to the market if your existing investors won't participate when you need more money. So ideally, you would want somebody that is able to do this. Deep pockets, obviously, you want them to be able to have the dry powder. And really importantly, it's great if you can have someone with a really awesome network of other angels to bring in. And not only if you're talking to angels, not only other angels, but maybe has that pipeline to the venture capital community or other institutions when you need the bigger money. So, make a list and think about that when you talk to investors. We won't talk a lot about debt financing. Startups just don't do debt. I'll just say it like that. Once you get established and you have revenues and you have, IP assets or other intangible IP assets, then we can do debt. But most of my companies don't do debt. If you do debt, I just want you to keep in mind, you're probably going to have to secure it. And you may be asked to give a personal guarantee. I really hope you don't do that. I've been through that many times when a company fails and the founder has to step up and pay the debts because of a personal guarantee. So resist that if you can. Some websites if you want to get grants. And I want to move on to, here we go, outside money. This is angels, VCs, crowdfunding, private equity. First of all, how much should you raise? Okay, how much money should you raise? We touched on this earlier. Let's talk more about that right now. So what I like to tell companies is you want to stage your financing. You want to raise just enough to get to that next event at which you get a new valuation, a higher valuation. That might be a product release. It might be an FDA approval. It might be, a tape out. It could be any of a number of events. It might be acquisition of customers. But you want to raise just enough money to get you to that event. That's the milestone. So you just figure out your burn rate, right? And figure out how long it'll take. And these words all kind of refer to the same general idea, burn rate, runway, but just how much money will it take for you to get to the next event, and then you can raise more money at the higher valuation, giving yourself a little bit of breathing room, of course. So that's how you figure out how much to raise. And once you figured that out, then the rest is just math, right? Once you figure that out and you figured out a valuation, or rather a percentage you're willing to give up, then it just becomes math. A little bit more on stage valuations. Just generally, you want your next ideally, you want your next valuation event to be 1 to 2 years out and probably 2 times your current valuation. Now, once in a while, you'll see somebody, especially now in a frothy market like we have today, you'll see founders raise a lot of money at too high a valuation. And that means when they get to the next milestone, they're not worth 2 times as much. They might be worth less than they were because they took money in at too high a valuation. That's not a good thing. It's not a good thing for a lot of reasons. Number one, it's a really bad message to the market if you do a down round. That tells the investors that something's wrong with the company. A down round is when the valuation is less than the previous valuation. You want the valuation to go up like this, in a nice upward facing arrow. If it's up and then down, the valuation, something's wrong with the company. It may not be, but that's the message you send. So it's not great to do down rounds. So be careful about valuation. You want to make sure that you are going to keep on that upward trajectory, even if you have to take money at a lower valuation now. And secondly, it actually hurts the founder because of some of the protective provisions that are contained in these deal documents. you as a founder could end up with less by taking money at too high a valuation now and then having to do a down round later. And if we had time, I would walk you through the math as to how that works. But trust me on this, you could end up in a worse position. So when you approach investors, I want to switch gears here and talk a little bit about the process. I know everybody wants to send out a humongous pitch deck and get an hour of their time to talk through your pitch deck. There's so much deal flow now, and investors are so overwhelmed. We're seeing so many companies. You need to do something a little bit more targeted and a little bit more efficient, and that is the executive summary. Now, this is a form. I've actually got a better version of the form as an appendix to my book, which I'll send to you. But this is the general idea. Just one page, just the facts, ma'am, right? Team, what are your projections? What's your market? What's the industry look like? And something about your intellectual property, and sort of anything else that really makes you stand out from the crowd. Okay, and that way the investor can decide at a glance whether they want to talk more. This is your elevator pitch in a one-page visual presentation. And it helps the investor weed out companies that are clearly not their space, right? Some investors just won't do biotech. If you're biotech, they'll know that immediately from your summary, and they don't have to read your whole pitch deck to find out. So that's the I guess, an oversimplified example, but you get the idea. Now, you will need a pitch deck, though. And after the executive summary, if the investor wants to learn more, you'll take them through your pitch deck. And I know Idea to IPO does whole hour presentations on pitch decks, so I'm not going to repeat it here. I'll just say two things, just anecdotally from my experience. Don't mention valuation in your pitch deck or in your executive summary. Don't mention your valuation. That's not for you to say, right? And this is the kind of thing where the investor typically tells you what they think you're worth. They make the first offer. It's negotiating 101. If you make the first offer, the investor is going to reduce that. In fact, one VC once told me that whenever, as a rule of thumb, whenever anybody comes to him and says, my valuation is X, he automatically thinks that his offer is going to be no more than X divided by 2. So keep that in mind. All right. You want them to put the valuation out, not you. Now, sometimes they will insist that you do that. And I've got an app for that, and we'll get to that later. But for your pitch deck, I wouldn't mention it. Secondly, and this is a little controversial, some people say don't waste a lot of time and money on your pitch deck. I think you need to spend some time and money on your pitch deck. And I recommend a professional designer because I've been in pitches where the pitch deck was not designed well. And I've listened to a VC say, first comment is you should get a designer. If they're focused on your weird graphics and they can't read the font, they're not thinking about the things you want them to read about. So that's just how I would do it. By the way, I did not have a professional designer do my slides. I did them myself. So I didn't take my own advice on my slides, but yours should be. Your pitch, again, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but just a couple of things is make sure that you're just right up front with your mission and your problem to be solved and your solution. I like I think it was Horowitz who said he wants to invest in aspirin, not vitamins. In other words, these are must-have solutions, not nice-to-have solutions. But if you can describe your solution in that sort of context, I think you're way better off. You definitely want to describe the opportunity. You do have to be prepared, even if you don't put it in a pitch deck, to talk about the competition. People are going to ask if it's a good idea. Somebody else might have thought about it. And for God's sakes, don't ever say we have no competitors, because nobody believes that, even if it's true. So when somebody asks you for competitors, if you have none, just think alternatives. All right. Think what the alternatives are. So for example, I know we got an agri-tech entrepreneur here. If your solution is just a really high-tech, robotic tractor that can zap weeds without using pesticides, and no one else has invented this, your competition are the pesticide companies, right? So think of it that, the herbicide companies. Think of it that way. And of course, product and business model. We could do a whole hour on business model, but that's not what I do. I'm just a lawyer. But hopefully you will have thought through that really carefully, because that is what most VCs think that they're expert in. All right, let's talk about some of the details here. The priced round. So eventually, I guess we'll come back to convertibles later, but well, I'm going to jump ahead in a minute. But let me just talk about the priced round. The priced round is when you actually sell stock. It's going to be to an institution. It's going to be for a relatively large amount of money, and it is going to be preferred stock. Now, remember what I said earlier, that the investor is going to value you. You're not going to give them a valuation, but sometimes they ask you to come up with a number and put it on the table. Well, if they do that, I've identified about 30 ways that people have used to value their companies. There's little dinky startups that are too early to, sorry, no offense, but you're too early to have enough metrics, EBITDA or revenues or customers. You're too early to have a lot of metrics for a professional valuation company. Here's some methods that we use to evaluate early stage companies. If somebody sends me an email about it, I can even send you my memo on this. There's some more of them. Crowdfunding, I'm going to jump ahead of that. Crowd financing, I do want to talk about. In 2012, when the Jobs Act was enacted and we got equity crowdfunding, which means that companies can go out and basically sell their securities through an internet portal, it was only for $1 million in a 12-month period. And it was very expensive to do. You had to have a business plan. You had to have an SEC filing. You had to have audited statements sometimes. You had to use a broker. So it was an expensive process, and I resisted it. I didn't think it made sense. I thought it was too cumbersome for the amount of money. Well, now you can sell up to $5 million worth of securities in a 12-month period to unaccredited investors, just almost anybody, but they can only invest small amounts, like a couple $1,000s at a time, on an internet portal. And there are a handful of platforms, I'm missing one of the big four, but that are very reputable, and quite a few others. So I've converted, I'm now a fan of crowdfunding. At first, the VC said, we don't want you to crowdfund. We don't want to have a million little $2,000 investors on your cap table. It's too much trouble. They're going to cause problems. But they've gotten over it. And they've gotten over it for a couple of reasons. Number one, there are now ways to consolidate all of those small investors through custodial arrangements and through some recent changes in the law through SPVs, special purpose vehicles. And secondly, companies can go out and they can sell not just common stock, but also other types of securities that are not going to mess up your cap table near as much. We also, it's not on the slide, but we can do this thing called testing the waters. So you can go out and find out if people are interested in investing before you actually make the offering. So crowdfunding has become way more useful than it used to be. And I think it's something every company should consider, especially if you're a consumer facing product, so that the people who have $2,000 to spend understand what you're doing, easily understand what you're doing. If it's something that they might buy and use. I recently invested in a crowdfunding because it was an app that finds you a parking space, because I live in California where, you go crazy trying to find parking spaces. So it's like, yeah, I totally get that. I would buy that product. I will invest in that company. So keep that in mind if you're that kind of company. There's also this thing called accredited only equity crowdfunding. I do way more of these deals. And the way the law changed in 2012, that we've all been using a lot now, is that we can advertise, you can solicit, you can generally solicit or advertise under 506C the sale of securities to accredited investors, providing that you verify that all of your investors are accredited. And by accredited, and this is a US rule, of course. I know we have a lot of non-US people here, but bear with me. By accredited, we mean that someone has more than $1 million in net worth, excluding personal residence, or makes more than $200,000 a year for the current year. The prior 2 years, $300,000 jointly. So it's used to be rich people. Now it means pretty much any Californian. We'll skip Reg A for now. I don't see many of those deals. As I said, most ICOs, those are initial coin offerings, have been forced offshore. So I get involved on the US side, but there's not much for me to do. Royalty financing. This is one you should think about. It's gaining popularity. Have you heard of the SEAL, the Shared Equity Appreciation Loan? That's another way of saying it. The idea is you go to the investor and you say, look, I'm going to sell you a piece of my future revenue. I'm not just going to sell you some equity in my company. What you get is a piece of my future revenue from this product or from this division, or maybe from my own company. So it's like a loan that gets paid out of the future revenue. It's a really interesting idea, and there are funds out there that's all they do is this sort of financing. And you see this concept also. Who was it? There was a musician recently that entered into some of these. I can't remember, but there's a famous musician that basically sold, he just sold a part of all of his future royalties to somebody. Royalty financing. So think about this as an alternative to raising money if you have the kind of company that is going to generate revenue or already is. Let's talk a little bit about angels. By the way, for those of you who are not in Chicago, that's a snow angel, which we used to make when I was a kid. So angels, angel groups, angel funds. Just want to mention that there are good angels, bad angels, and ugly angels. And that's from the Clint Eastwood movie, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which if you've never seen, you should stop watching this webinar right now and go on YouTube and download it because it is an awesome movie. The good angels are going to give you connections to the VCs. They're going to give you mentorship, and they understand that what they're doing is extremely risky. Okay, those are good angels. Find those guys and hang on to them. Bad angels are what I call hostage takers, whiners, and demanders. And generally, they're going to constantly remind you that you took their money, and therefore you have to do what they say. Or they're going to complain about everything you do. It's never going to be good enough. Or they're going to be constantly demanding stuff from you and creating distraction. Those are bad angels. And you can find out who a bad angel is by doing a little diligence and maybe asking who else they've invested in and how did that work out for them? Because you don't want to be spending all of your time providing cap tables to people. Just this morning, I'm getting emails from bad angels saying, give me this, give me that, and prepare this document, prepare that. It's very expensive when you have to get your lawyer to prepare documents for bad angels who got nothing better to do. And then there are the ugly, and those are the potential plaintiffs, okay? These are the people that, that they just don't understand that this is risky business. They don't understand that companies sometimes have to pivot, and they will threaten you with a lawsuit. And it's easy, it's not easy, it may not be easy, but you can find out who they are by searching the court records and see if they've sued anybody. And that is the very first thing that I do. Usually when I do diligence on an investor in one of my client companies, if they ask me to, I'll go find out who they are, and whether they're difficult to deal with, and whether if they get dissatisfied that they're willing to run into court. Because it's anyone here in California, anyone with $2,500 can run into court and make your life a hell. So you do not want to deal with those people. In fact, I'll go one step further. The other thing that I do, this is a little pro tip. It's not only do I research the investors, I research their lawyers, because lawyers have reputations. And if the lawyer for somebody is someone that I know is extremely aggressive and litigious, I'll let my client know that you're taking a high risk, that you're going to be in an aggressive, litigious environment if you do this deal. So just be careful. Be careful when you take money. And of course, there are always the disturbers who are just always out there working against the company, creating drama. I have seen angels reach out to the next funders and talk them out of financing the company because they didn't like the valuation. And we could talk a lot about that. In fact, I do in my book. So you just need to avoid those people, understand who you're dealing with. Well, we're getting down to the end. So the last thing that I am going to talk about is safes and convertible notes. I'm glad we got to this because they're everywhere in all markets. And here on the West Coast where I am, hardly ever do we see a convertible note, hardly ever. And what's a convertible note? The idea is that the investor says, look, I don't know what your company is worth. So here's what I'll do. I'll loan you the money today and you convert my loan into stock at some date in the future at some valuation we agree to now, or whatever valuation that you get in your next financing. That here on the West Coast has become what we call a SAFE, a simple agreement for future equity, which is like a loan, but has no loan features. So in other words, the investor gives the company the money and with the understanding that the investor is going to get stock, preferred stock, in its first preferred stock financing at the valuation or a discount to the valuation in that financing, when and if they do it. If they don't do a financing, the investor doesn't get paid. If they do a sale, the investor will get a percentage back as if it converted to stock. But if the company fails, there's no debt obligation. A SAFE is way better for the company than a debt obligation. Way better. First of all, the company doesn't have to pay interest on a SAFE. You have to pay interest on a debt. The SAFE can be out there for a long period of time. These convertible debts are generally short term. And most importantly, a SAFE doesn't have to be repaid. A debt does, right? And if it's not, then you're in default on the debt. And sometimes creditors, investors of a debt, they can foreclose on that debt, right? And they can sue the company. And I've seen debt holders end up with the company. So SAFEs are way better. It's what we always do on the West Coast now. In other parts of the country, not so much. There's more convertible debt. So you'll just have to deal with it. Just understand what you're getting into. Know that the valuation cap that sets a maximum value at which the note or the SAFE will convert. So in my neighborhood, that's usually for an early stage company around $10 to $12 million these days, and probably more now, depending on the company. But the important thing is that the idea is somebody puts their money into your company and you're going to convert in a next equity financing at a discount to the valuation in that financing, but at no higher valuation than some number, let's say $10 million. That kind of guarantees your safe holder that they're getting in early and they're getting the benefit of an earlier valuation. So you always see valuation caps, almost always, in safes and notes these days. And then the discount. Let's say the financing is not at the valuation cap, it's below that. The investor, they got in early, they saw the future, they get a benefit for that. So they get their stock a little cheaper than what the VCs pay. All righty, we are at the top of the hour. I got through 38 of my 10,000 slides, so I think we did pretty good. And let's open it up to questions. I see a handful of questions in the Q&A box here. All right. Okay. Is it hard to get gambling projects funded? If yes, what are the reasons? Well, yes, it is hard because, it depends. If it's in the US, yeah, it's really hard because gambling, I've had companies doing that, and because it's an illegal business in most states, that's probably the reason why. And where we've done it is where we've been able to not be gambling and to be games of skill and not games of chance, which is an interesting sort of way to look at it, but it is state specific. So it's a chore. If you really are a gambling company and not a gaming company, yeah, you have to do that offshore. And that's going to be a challenge. It's less of a challenge now because of COVID, the investors are more willing to go outside their little neighborhoods to do investments. But it's still a challenge in my neighborhood in Silicon Valley, because there's so many deals that are located, companies right here, that investors really don't have to invest in foreign companies. And if you're a gambling company, you're going to be in a jurisdiction that allows gambling, and that's not going to be where I am. So I think yes, and that's the reason. I'm thinking about setting up it's a long question. Setting up a blockchain-based supply chain. Yeah, with blockchain, you can see exactly what's going on and advantage in terms of security. Yep, that's all true. Confidence to both the consumer and the seller, especially in food and medicine where logistics is important. How valuable is such an idea, and will it receive investment? Well, yeah, a lot of people are thinking about that and doing that. So it's a great idea. It's a crowded space, like most spaces are crowded, by the way. By the way, don't ever be afraid when someone says it's a crowded space. I think most spaces are crowded. If it's a good idea, other people are going to do it. And by the way, put your questions in the Q&A box if you have them, not the chat. Anyway, back to your question. So blockchain, everything you just said about distributed ledger, I think is true. And these last supply chain challenges over COVID really showed us how fragile our supply chain is. So you've got that going for you because it needs some upgrades. Secondly, consumers are really concerned about provenance, and blockchain provides that, right? You can see where that fish was tagged, or you can see whether that product was tagged organic, certified organic. But of course, the problem, as you know, is that you have to have what we call oracles to take that real world data and put it onto the blockchain. And that's where we have a little bit of a disconnect, right? Because so it's not perfect, but it is an advantage for sure. I think it gives the consumers some comfort. I got to warn you though, in blockchain, it depends on what you mean by supply chain. If you mean food, you said food. 3 years ago, this was super hot. A lot of companies were doing this, but I think you are competing now with a technology that instead of relying on the blockchain and those oracles who may or may not be reliable. By the way, an oracle, for those of you who don't do blockchain, that's just a real world person or a sensor or a device or whatever takes the real world data and puts it onto the blockchain, okay? Might be the person that, that scans the tag or puts the tag on a fish and scans it in. Anyway, so what I've seen replace that now as a competitor are sensors that will simply tell you whether, where, believe it or not, they can scan and they can test and they can tell you through RNA type technologies, where that fish came from, etc. So just keep that in mind. But I still am a big believer in distributed ledger. Generally, I just think the bloom is a little off the rose. It's kind of just my sense of it. And people talk about blockchain, it's all about NFTs now. All right, so I'd be careful with that one. For a few startups, we guide them into franchising to reduce dilution of equity. Okay, so the comment about non-dilutive equity, which is franchising, which is a lot like licensing. Gotcha. Okay, you have an idea but no team. Should you ask for funding to build a team, or should you try to form a team in a different way first? Wow, sounds like a real chicken and egg problem, isn't it? You can't get funding until you have a team. You can't have a team until you can pay them. So here's what we do. And that's every startup's dilemma, by the way. And here's what we do. We reward people with equity, right? So you form a team, they get equity. And they tend to work for equity until you can get that first angel funding. Now, that's the general way of doing it. And you're not going to be paying people until you raise money. So everybody knows that, certainly not the founders. Now, let me tell you the problem with that. The risk with that and the problem with that is that we have minimum wage laws, both federally and in the states. And the federal government has a sensible sort of start out founders exception. That's not so clear in California. So everybody does that, but they very well may be violating minimum wage laws. And you only get away with compensating your team with equity and not cash, and not currently, if it's people who are founders, right? Who are partners in your venture. You can't do this with your receptionist, right? You can't pay your babysitter in equity. They have to be paid in cash or you're going to violate wage and hour laws. Very tricky stuff. Anyway, so that's the answer, and that's the cautionary tale. Okay, we will be distributing a recording as well as the slides hopefully later today. What's the difference between royal and safe? Sorry, I've never heard the term royal. Safe is simple agreement for future equity. It's not simple, it's not equity, and it's certainly not safe. What it is, it's the idea that the investor gives the company money today and they get the equity in the future when the company does its first preferred stock financing. Okay, are VCs okay with founder having founder preferred Series FF shares? Up to what % of founders' total shares? Okay, good question. I'm going to talk about two of those now. In fact, I'm going to talk about it right from my book because I have a whole chapter on founders preferred and F shares. And the thing to keep in mind about both of these, it's on page 104 of my book, is that there's two kinds. So Class F common is number one, first one I want to talk about. Class F common means, this is what Zuckerberg has, right? And what the Snapchat founder has. It means that the founder is not going to lose control of the company because they got this super voting right attached to their shares. It's common, but it has a super high voting right. I see founders want to do that sometimes because they want to have more votes than all the other common combined. I try to talk them out of it because that's only going to last until your investors come along and say, look, we don't want that complexity on a cap table. And for sure, we don't want you, one person, having so much power. But that's Class F found. I mean, you may have to give it up later. Let me just put it that way. And it might be just one more thing that you have to negotiate away. Series FF stock, on the other hand, you said Series FF, which is what I think you're asking about. That's a little different. That allows a founder to take money off the table when you have an exit of the company. Now, this is a little tricky, so I'm going to spend some time on this. The way it works is if a founder has Series FF stock, an investor comes along, they can buy stock, preferred stock from the company. Company gets the cash. That's what we want. But the founder says, gee, I want to get some liquidity too. I've been eating top ramen for the last 5 years. Give me some money. So the investor will buy the Series FF stock from the founder. So now the founder has the money, the investor has a Series FF stock, and that FF stock converts into preferred. So the investor ends up with preferred, founder ends up with money, and the company gets a piece of it as well. That's Series FF, and we're seeing it more and more. The challenge here is that we have to be careful in setting that up, that the FF stock is actually issued in exchange for some valuable property and not at too cheap a discount. If we do it wrong, the founder has a big tax problem when it's set up. So be careful about it. I'm seeing it more and more. I'm seeing it used more often. I'm seeing way more founders taking money off the table than ever before, especially at B stage. And in fact, so much so that the VCs are also very much more interested in getting liquidity in the second markets as well, because geez, the founders are cashing out. Maybe we should cash out a little bit too. So yeah, they're okay with it. Depends on the VC. And if they're not okay with it, they'll let you know. The only downside, I think, well, two things. You got to be careful about the tax. You need a tax lawyer to do this. And number two, in fact, I'm going to circle back to this if we have time at the end. I'll tell you some more stories. And number two, it's one more thing to negotiate with your VCs. All righty. Next question. How should one deal with your concerns about the cap valuation on safes? Well, here you have to model it. You know, you have to get really good. You have to be an Excel jockey and just really good at knowing where you are and what will happen at any given time. There's two things. That's number one, just know, you know, how many safes are out there and what the valuation cap is and how much of your company you've given away. Number two, And if you don't hear anything else I've said for the last hour and a half, please hear this. Please listen to this. Do pre-money safes, right? If you're a company, sell pre-money safes, because post-money safes, you give up way more of your, potentially you could give up way more of your company. Now, let me talk about this. What's the difference? A pre-money safe will convert at a pre-money valuation. In other words, if there's additional safes issued after the investor buys his pre-money safe, everybody shares in that dilution, which makes sense. You're getting a smaller percentage of a bigger pie, right? There's more money in the company. A post-money safe pegs the percent that the investor is going to get after the issuance of all those other safes and option pool, by the way, which makes no sense because you could have 1% of a $1 million company or 1% of a $1 billion company for your investment. Depends how many safes you sold. Okay, the post-money safe works okay if you're going to do that equity round fairly soon after you sell the safe. It works terribly if you're going to sell lots and lots and lots of safes. So that's number one, do the pre-money safe. Now, the Y Combinator form that everybody uses is post-money. And I have investors argue with me all day, about how this is the market standard and you should let me have this because everybody gets this. I'm just telling you as the company, you be very careful about this and model it because you could be giving up a whole lot more than you think with a post-money safe. I actually think it's sneaky. I think it's kind of deceptive and I think it's nonsensical. Anyway, that's my opinion. Of course, when I'm on the investor side, my opinion is completely different. It's market. So I just want you to understand what you're getting into. And by the way, we still do. Sometimes investors will insist on a post-money safe and we'll just do it because it's relatively small dollars and we're going to have the equity financing soon. So it's not a big deal, but you do need to model it is what I'm trying to say. What was the other part of this? Okay, so that's how we deal with my concern. That's the biggest way we deal with the cap valuations. The other thing I would tell you is the valuation should be higher than today's value. Everybody sets a cap. You know what I mean by a valuation cap? So the safe will convert either at the lower of the price that the stock sells in your preferred stock financing or at some agreed upon valuation. And everybody sets that valuation. I think they should set it at today's value. You should not do that. You should set it at a future higher value because you're trying to protect against, some, like I say, some crazy event. But I think I'm going to lose that battle. So maybe I should stop talking about it. How do we get access to angels when we will know we are ready to pitch? Well, angels are different than VCs. VCs advertise. They have websites. They go to events. They sit on panels. They let me ask them questions. Angels, a lot of times, they will hide because they will be inundated if they don't with pitches. So here's a good way to get access to angels. If you have friends who are investors or who are founders and they've got money, you should ask them who invested in their company and if they're willing to make an introduction. That is the number one best possible thing you could do, because then you're getting you're a very qualified lead. Let me put it that way. You're getting an introduction by somebody that the angel trusts. Alternatively, you just have to network and go to events and do pitch events, and you just need to be out there meeting people. It's probably harder now because of COVID, but we're all coming back and we're doing things by Zoom. But you kind of have to get out there. And that is why people still come to Silicon Valley. That's why not everybody in Palo Alto lives in Austin now, because despite all our goofy rules in this state, there still is a community here that's pretty important. What do you recommend for reaching out to investors you don't know? Is it worth the time? It depends on the investor. Some of them promise to read every summary that you send to them. We had one on our panel last month, a couple months ago. Most of them won't. I think an introduction is 10 times better because well-known investors, they are inundated with this stuff. So get an introduction and then do an executive summary because, people just, it's just psychology. People will not even start to read a book. You send them a pitch deck, they won't even start to read it. They know they can't get through it. But if it's a really just a one-page blurb, they'll say, yeah, that's going to take me, 2 minutes. I can spend that time looking at it. Will VCs accept a dual class structure, 0 vote and 1 vote, used to reduce dilution of voting control? Will VCs get voting shares? Yeah, I've heard of this. It's just not common in my practice, and I don't think in my area. That's a little bit more. So here's my rule on all this stuff, all of these exotic cap tables. My rule is the KISS principle, right? Keep it simple, because you want your investor, when they're looking at your company, and all of your competitors, by the way, are alternative places to put their money. You want them focused on the team and the problem you're solving and how you're going to change the world and how they're going to get their name in lights and make 100 times their money. You want them focused on all those things. You do not want them focused on your novel, interesting, clever cap table that requires a mathematician to figure out. So I like to keep it simple. That's kind of my general operating principle. Now, will they accept it? It depends on the company and how much leverage you have. But I wouldn't come out with that unless there's really, really good reasons. Other thing you say in your question about 0 vote shares for option pool employees, I just wouldn't do that. Every once in a while somebody insists on it. It's just such a bad idea, I think. And the reason why is, first of all, the optionees, it's not likely, and they may never have enough shares to actually influence a vote, right? Because optionees typically don't exercise. They just sit there and wait and get cashed out. So worrying about voting rights for optionees is you're worrying about a problem that probably doesn't exist. However, you are creating a problem that did not exist either. Now you got to go tell your optionees that you give them an option on non-voting shares, unlike every other company in Silicon Valley where the employees get options on voting shares. So you're telling them you don't value them as much as your competitor company values their employees. So I just would avoid it. How often do the VCs try to screw over the company with a very bad deal, or generally do they try to be fair? You're so young. Like a judge once said to me in court, he said, very few people are bad, but most people are self-interested. So I would say that very few VCs are bad, but all of them are self-interested. So of course, they are, going to do what makes sense for themselves. Now, try to be fair. The two things. Number one, the good news is that the market is like super efficient right now. And this is counterintuitive, but the bigger and more established the VC, kind of the more standardized the terms and simpler the term sheet and more likelihood you're going to close. That's been my experience. So most of these deals that are getting done, and especially because there's so much money in the market chasing deals, I think they are very fair. If they're happening here in Silicon Valley, they're very fair. On the other hand, I've seen deals that emanate from other parts of the world that are not fair. And once you get out of this valley, things change. This is a small valley. Everybody knows each other. People get reputations. VCs get reputations. So I think generally, we play our football game, between the 40-yard lines. There's a fairly narrow area that we negotiate stuff. You get outside this valley and outside this country, that football field opens up and a lot more things are up for game and you could be taken advantage of. Now, having said that, I have come across situations in my career where the VCs acted just terribly. They did things that were completely unfair. I've given talks here to ID to IPO about founders that totally sold the farm without knowing it, gave away the farm without knowing it. I talk about a founder I know who the company she founded was sold for $500 million, and she got zero big goose egg out of it because of an insider round that happened years before that she didn't even know about, which is totally unfair. So you have to be careful. You have to arm yourself and make sure that none of that stuff goes on. But from my standpoint, yeah, I think most VCs in this valley, especially in this market, are giving you pretty fair terms. Now, what do you think about NFTs and advertising? Is it manageable for ad tech companies to take funds if they are from blockchain? Well, that certainly is the next big craze. We could go on for an hour and we've only got 7 minutes. And I'm not going to do that. And I'm not an expert in NFTs. The experts I do know in NFTs are all over the board on this. Some of them think it's the best thing in the world. Most of them think it's not a security. Most of them think it's just going to be a huge boon to startup funding if you can tokenize and sell. And then I've heard some people that think it's a big Ponzi scheme. So I'm not going to talk about that today. How likely is it to get an investment for a project based abroad? So it's easier now than it used to be. It's the good news is there's a bigger worldwide venture capital community. The second good news is that investors here in Silicon Valley are willing to invest outside the country way more than they were in the past. So it's a lot easier now than it used to be. Let me put it that way. I'm not going to name your country, but I will say that you're in a part of the world that I think is probably you're going to have some political difficulties because of what's going on in the world today. I'll just leave it at that. Okay, here we got a climate smart agriculture initiative that drives yields. We want to target other parts of the world. We did medical devices first. I see a lot of that, by the way, people coming from biotech or medical device into agriculture. There's a lot of crossover. And I've got a background in agriculture. I worked on a farm. Will this be enough credibility for investors given my lack of ag tech experience? Okay, well, let me kind of give you the broader question there is, I think most companies have more than one founder. I'll just say it. Most successful companies do. And there's a reason why. It's a lot harder to have one person that can do all the essential pieces, which means technology, and it means industry expertise and domain knowledge, right? So in your company, how many farmers can code, right? Because that's what you would need to have one founder that could do this. So if you don't have all of that in one brain, like most companies don't, you get co-founders, and you should definitely have a technical co-founder. Talk all about it in my book, okay? There it is. So get a technical co-founder. I'm going to go one step further and say you should also have a co-founder with domain expertise. So if your market is agriculture, you either have a co-founder or an advisor. You can do this by advisor probably. Technical, it's got to be a founder because you need someone that's going to work those long nights for low pay. And only founders will do that. But you'll also need somebody that really understands the industry, I think, and understands how your product is going to help. So in agriculture in particular, 10 years ago when we started our initiative, everybody was coming out with apps that would solve problems that didn't exist, right? And they would have iPad apps for farmers who didn't have any internet access and stuff like that. You really needed someone who understands farming to, I think, involved in an ag tech company. And you also need someone who really understands technology and these days data. Okay, royalty financing. Let's see. Okay, and you were talking about film financing models. Is there crossover with startups, like separate films in a series? Okay, that's a really long question, so I'll boil it down. the question is, people have been financing films with stuff like this for a long time. And I used to do that. I started my career 30 years ago doing work with Hollywood production companies. And well, I never want to go back to that. So anyway, yes, there is some crossover. Now, the traditional method here in Silicon Valley is, some founder money, some safes, maybe some Series seed preferred, then another round of preferred. You might have a crowd financing before that. And then you're going to do an M&A, a SPAC, or an IPO, or a T-SPAC or IPO. But I'm seeing more and more of this royalty financing model out there. And it's more prominent in other parts of the country than where I am, no doubt, but it still exists. And I think it's something that can be used. What I don't like about it is that the VCs will view it as debt. And VCs, the only thing they like less than debt is taxes. So you're going to have debt on even if it's not debt on your balance sheet, they will value it as debt because it ranks ahead of them. That's the one bad thing about it. But if you don't need VCs, and remember, only 0.5% of companies do, it could be a very viable way to get going. All right. Can you speak about crowdfunding and what you give away for funds? Okay, this will have to be our last question. So like I say, when Jobs Act was first enacted in 2012, I was somewhat of a skeptic. I thought it was just going to generate tons of lawsuits. I've completely turned around on that. And also I talked to VCs, and most of them, not all of them, but most of them I talked to said, no, we don't want you to do that because we don't want 100, common stockholders, unaccredited, stockholders on your cap table who might sue me down the road. So since then, the market has matured, it has evolved. The bad actors, I think, have been pushed out, and there are some very good crowdfunding sites. So you can raise up to 5 million. You can test the waters, which is awesome because you don't have to just go out there and put it out and then fail, and the world knows you failed. You can test the waters by seeing if people will invest before you make the offering, and you can use safes. So you don't have to give away common stock in the offering. You can use SPVs so you can control the voting. So I think it's a really good vehicle. I've changed my mind on crowdfunding. So yeah, I like it. What was the other part of this question? Crowd financing and what you give away for funds. I forgot what I was going to say. Anyway, so the bottom line is that, yeah, crowdfunding is a very viable way for early stage companies to raise money. Just do it right. I remember what I was going to say is that there are some very reputable sites now that have nobody's, I think, is the 800-pound gorilla, but there are several sites that are dominant. Be careful which crowdfunding site you list on, which portal. You do not want to be on a market for lemons. So go on the site, see who else is there, see if there's been any big successes. You might also Google it. You don't even have to go to the SEC website. Just Google it if there's been any enforcement actions against the crowdfunding site. You're known by the company that you keep, right? So if you do go the crowdfunding route, make sure that you do it with a very reputable portal or platform. Okay, that's it. We are past 10:30 Pacific. I'm sorry I did not get to all your questions, but I'll tell you what, I'm going to post once again my contact information. Find me on LinkedIn, and if you'd like to talk more, feel free to email me, and we'll talk next week. Not this week because I'm going ice climbing, but we'll talk next week. And let me also suggest that you join our LinkedIn page for startups, and that you subscribe to our YouTube channel. So I'm going to give you a couple more links. There you go. Okay, well, I want to thank ID to IPO for producing this. I want to thank you, the audience, for being here. Thank you, Jennifer, for that awesome introduction. Thank you, audience, for attending. And at this point, we're going to conclude the webinar, and I'm going to leave the chat up open for a little bit, but we're going to formally conclude the webinar, and we will see you next time.